Okay, today we're going to be learning Megillah Daf Kafeh. Today's daf is sponsored by Rivka Israth in loving memory of her mother, Gittel Bas Sarah Rav Ze'ev Friedman Halevi, on the occasion of her shloshim. She was the sole survivor of a family of 8 who were murdered in the Shoah. She survived 2 years in Auschwitz between the ages of 14 and 16 and went on to fulfill her father's tefillah, asking for the survival of one family member so that the family would not be extinguished. She founded a new family, now numbering 16 grandchildren and 30 great-grandchildren, Mishibi and Militzat Yosher for all. Today's daf is also sponsored by Harriet Harmon in loving memory of Baruch Wurzberger on his 3rd Yurtzeit. He's my husband's, Zichrono Lebracha, longest and best friend, whose devotion to Torah learning and tefillah inspired me to grow closer to the depth of understanding what daf Yomi brings. Okay, we're going to get started. Before we get started, 2 things. One is reminder, the Siyum, the registration is up. The Siyum is going to be on Sunday, even though we're going to finish Thursday. Next Thursday, it'll be the Sunday following. Okay, this Sunday is the beginner's course starting. Then we'll have the Siyum and then 2 more sessions of the beginner's course. And we'll be a little bit out of order. Again, just to remind you, Thursday, there won't be a daf. Again, this is next Thursday, a week from today. There won't be a regular daf. Friday, we will start Moed Katan, even though we really haven't finished Megillah. And then Friday, Shabbat will be Moed Katan. And then Sunday, there'll be a regular class on Moed Katan. And in the whatever time it is by you, the Siyum will be the same time the Siyum always is, around 8:30. And that's the plan. Okay, we have a good program planned. Rabbanit Gila Rosen is speaking. We have a junior high school student learning the daf who will be speaking. And so please all attend. There will be a Hebrew Siyum if you're interested also on Thursday night. And that will be with Rabbanit Esti Rosenberg from Migdal Oz. Okay, the second thing I want to do is correct 2 mistakes from yesterday. So Gita, thank you for pointing out one of them. And the other one, I just quickly ended the daf a little too fast and made a mistake in the way I read it. So I'm going to fix both right now. In that really interesting Tosfot about the blind person and about him being exempt from mitzvot on the Torah level, right? Rabbi Yehuda holds that assumes patur mitzvot on the Torah level. So how could he possibly say here that we're distinguishing between a blind person who could never see and a blind person who at one point was able to see when it comes to this Pores al Shema? So Tosfot says that basically in order not to estrange a blind person, we're going to obligate him, according to Tosfot, and this I explained incorrectly, on a rabbinic level, he's going to be obligated for all Torah mitzvot. Okay, so basically what we have going on here is there's an obligation on a rabbinic level to keep all the mitzvot in the Torah. So on a Torah level, he's not obligated or she is not obligated, but on a rabbinic level, they're going to be obligated in the mitzvot on the Torah, and that's to kind of keep them in the fold. Okay, there's a bit of a problem with this. Some of the commentaries raise an issue. I believe I saw it in the Rashba and others. There's a bit of an issue. If you obligate someone Rabbanit to mitzvah d'oraita, becomes obligated d'oraita because there's a mitzvah of lo tasur min hadavar she'yidu l'cha yiminu small. There's a mitzvah d'oraita to listen to the rabbis, so that it becomes a d'oraita obligation. People ask some questions on the Tosfot, but anyway, what I wanted to point out was that interesting thing he said, which was, first of all, the comparison between women and a blind person. The women are included in some mitzvot, and therefore we don't need to say we're going to obligate them by rabbinic law and all sorts of other things. And also, this concept in general about not wanting to estrange anyone. Okay, next, the end of the daf, I'm just going to reread the section and explain it better. I'll tell you what I did wrong. I explained Rava and Rav Papa as 2 different answers, and it's not true. Rava was really explaining the Braita that we're going to quote right now, and then Rav Papa is coming to give his answer. So we ended with this, Hauset tfilato agula sakana ve'em b'mitzvah, right? The Mishnah had said, if you make rounded tefillin like a ball, right, then it's dangerous. By the way, I saw someone else who said it's not just that we're worried of bumping into something, but they said even when you do nefilat apayim, which we've been talking about, tachanun, and you put your head down on your hand, you could theoretically shove the tefillin into your head. Okay, right? This is a good example of where mitzvah could be potentially dangerous. So therefore, we can't make tefillin in that way. That's what the Mishnah says. Should we say that this Mishnah is saying the same thing it says in the Braita? Because the Braita says, square tefillin are halach l'Moshe Sinai passed down. We know they have to be square. So, and in addition, and this is part of the question still, where you stitch it, it has to be a square, right? The bottom, the base part, and the angles of them, meaning everything has to be a perfect square. So don't we see the same thing in the Braita, to which they say, Amar Papa Manitin Davida Ki Am Goza. No, our Mishnah is talking about a rounded shape like a ball or a sphere, something like that, whereas the Braita is referring to even if it were to be flat and there's no issue of danger, again, the content's the same, it's just the structure of the Gemara is different than I said, then it's adding this added element of the shape also of the above part, even if there's no danger involved. So therefore, the Mishnah and the Braita are talking a little bit about two different things. Okay, next, new Mishnah. It's really connected with the previous one. What we saw in the beginning of the previous one, without dealing with the tefillin issue, we saw these things about someone who gets up to daven as the chazan. Sometimes there was a concern that he was a heretic, and there were certain signs that someone's a heretic. And if they were, then basically we'd say, sorry, but you can't daven, because we didn't want heretics being our prayer leaders. So, and this is obviously in a time in the Mishnah where there were heretics, there were people who didn't believe in, there were all these different sects, people who didn't believe in the rabbinic traditions of the rabbis. There were people who believed in multiple gods. There were all sorts of things going around, even within Judaism. And we wanted to make sure that those aren't the people who were praying on our behalf. So ha'omer yivarchucha tovim. The good people should bless you. Harezo derech haminu. This is a very interesting thing. Why is this? A bunch of different interpretations. I'll go with two of them, even though there's more. Either Rashi says you're not including Risha'im. Now, we're all one nation. We don't look at ourselves as there's the good people and they're supposed to pray for God, and then there's the bad people. Well, we don't really care about the bad people. They're really not part of our community. We don't view it that way, right? It's like the famous about Bruria, who said, it's chata'im in the ar, it's not chot'im. We're not getting rid of sinners. We're getting rid of sins, right? And people, we don't put people off to the side and say, oh, you're not part of us because you sin. No. We're all one community. So it's not just the good people. Okay, that's one problem. Some people say it's angels, that you're saying only the angels should praise God and not humans. That sounds like, right, we don't believe that angels are the ones praising God and not us. There's a bunch of different interpretations. It also, by the way, it goes back to this idea of, we're going to see going ahead about this, the heretics believed in two different gods, right? That maybe there's a God over the good and maybe there's a God over the bad. And therefore the good people should bless God because God is the God, our God is the God over good people. And there's a different God who's in charge of bad people. And that we're going to see in the continuation of this idea that they believed in two rishuyot, right? That there's two different gods in the world, or possibly even more. Al kain sipor yagiu rachamecha, right? This is very famous, that shiloach hakein, the mitzvah to send away the mother bird before you take her, the small birds, right? So al kain sipor yagiu rachamecha, the God's rachamim should go to the bird's nest. We're going to have to see what exactly the issue is, big machloket about why it's a problem to say this. Al tov yizacher shimcha, your name should be mentioned with good things, not only with good things. So, right, what's the problem with that? We'll see later, because you're supposed to bless God also for the bad. That's why we say Baruch Dayan Emet. We don't only bless God for the good. Right? We don't only mention God's name as if he's only in charge. Again, it's like there's a God of good things and there's a God of bad things, right? We don't believe that. We believe all of it comes from God. Modim, mishatkinoto. If you say modim twice, okay, it's not clear here when we say this, what we mean modim in the davening, right? The bracha of modim, it's where do you say the word modim, or do you say modim anachnu lach and stop at some point and then say it a second time? It's not exactly clear. We'll see in the Gemara when they compare this to Shema and saying it twice, we'll see that although we'll see it's not really clear from the Gemara, it's not conclusive. Which one are we talking about? But there is at least some reference to it later in the Gemara. So mishatkinoto, all these things, if anybody says this, we silence them. Okay, we say, that no place in prayer for things like this. By the way, these are comments made in prayer, not necessarily on the street. It doesn't seem like that's the problem. The problem is in prayer, and possibly only the chazan, but and then we don't want him to be chazan anymore because it's a sign he's a heretic, or he's saying something that could be misconstrued to sound like heresy. Here we get into people who translate verses in an incorrect manner. So if somebody translates the psukim of arayot, where it says you can't sleep with this person, you can't sleep with that person, and they translate it that it's almost allegorical and not really referring to sexual relations, but to something else. We'll see in the Gemara what that could be. We silence him because he's misinterpreting a verse. This was one of the idols that people would worship by sacrificing their son to the molech. And it says in the Torah, you can't do that. if you translate it again allegorically to say, Lo titen la abra bar miyuta, you shouldn't get an Aramean woman, non-Jewish woman, pregnant. Okay, they term laha avir from ibor, from lehit abel, to get pregnant. Okay, we'll talk about this in the Gemara, exactly how they would get from this verse to that. Mishat kinoto benizifa. This is even stronger, right? They rebuke him. Okay, silence him with rebuke. So the Gemara says, Bishlama. So now we're going to go through all these cases. Bishlama modim modim demechse kashte v'shiyah. Modim modim, we understand. Sounds like you're praying to two different gods. Val tov yisachar shimcha nami. Demashma al tov in al alo. Sounds like you're only praising God for good and not for bad. Utnan, it says in the Mishnah, chayav adam levarech al hara'a kashem shu mevarech al tova. Right? You have to bless God for the bad and for the good, and therefore, right? That's why we say, like I said, Baruch Dayan Emet, and therefore you can't do this, right? You can't just say I'm the good. Ela al ken sipur yagiu rachamecha my taima. So there's a big famous machloket here. In Israel, there's a machloket between two Amoraim, Rabbi Yossi bar Av and Rabbi Yossi bar Zveda. One says, because you're creating jealousy among the creatures, because you're saying that God's rachamim should get to the, right, to the birds. Almost like the birds, yes, but not to anywhere else. It shows God has rachmanim, has mercy on the birds. And right, and just like he has mercy on the birds should come to me. But it's sounding like, the animals will say, what about us? Why doesn't God have mercy on us? Okay, that's first of all. The second answer is Chadamar, and this is very famous because it's a very famous machloket Rambam and Ramban about this, and it all has to do with, can we darshan ta'amei mitzvot or not? Can we say we know the reasons for mitzvot? So one says, it's saying that the mitzvot are meant to be, right, rachamim, meant to be, right, mercy, like God's midot are merciful. We have no idea why God gives us these mitzvot. We can't start darshaning ta'amei mitzvot. We can't start saying we know what the mitzvot are. Okay, so there's a big debate about how exactly to understand this, okay? The Rambam says basically that it's a problem to be darshaning ta'amei mitzvot. That's what this opinion is saying. Okay, what's interesting is the Rambam doesn't actually hold by this opinion. The Rambam says you are actually allowed to darshan ta'amei mitzvot, but he understands that that's what this person is saying. You're not allowed to try to understand the reason for the mitzvot. It's a bit of a contradiction in the Rambam, because the Rambam elsewhere, when he talks about this line specifically, this halacha, he explains it according to this opinion, even though elsewhere he says that you are allowed to darshan ta'amei mitzvot, and it's against this, right? And that we just don't hold like this opinion. So it's a bit of a contradiction in the Rambam that people grapple with. I'm just going to throw it out there. But there's, right, and that's basically, right, do we have the right to explain why God does things? That's the way to, right, to understand this machloket, whether you say this or not. Okay, the second thing is the Ramban. Okay, the Ramban, that it's not about God's mercy to the birds, but it's that God is trying, in other words, the 1 second, let me just make sure I have it straight. Right. It's not that God, people are going to think that God has mercy for the birds. And as the Ramban says, of course you can darshan ta'amei mitzvot. And even the person who says this says you can darshan ta'amei mitzvot. No problem. Like mitzvot were given. There's reasons for mitzvot. You can try to understand them. However, what's this person saying? We don't want you to say, that the reason for the mitzvah is that God has mercy on birds. God doesn't have mercy on birds. God has mercy toward humans. But what is it? God, why did God give us the mitzvah? Not because he has mercy on birds, but because he wants us to learn to be rachmanim, right? It's so that we train ourselves. If we can have mercy on birds, then we'll learn to have mercy on people as well. And that's the reason for the mitzvah. But don't say that it's because God is merciful, okay? So moving on, okay? It's a big famous machloket. You can look more in depth about it. I'm sure if you have any Gemara with commentary, they talk about this machloket. Okay, now we're going to have a case where this happened. Okay, and something very interesting is going to happen. Somebody goes to pray before Rabbi. That means he was the Khazani Rabbi's shul, basically. Amar, atah chastal ken sipur, atah chus v'rachem aleinu. Said, God, you had rachamim on the bird. You should have rachamim aleinu, which is basically the same thing. Atah chastal lo tov et beno, atah chus v'rachem aleinu. You have mercy on the animals. You should have mercy on us. Amar Rabba, Rabba says, wow, this person really knows how to appease God. What a beautiful thing. What a beautiful prayer. So Abaye is standing right around. And Abaye, if you remember, was adopted by Rabba and learned by Rabba. Amalei Abaye, now, what are you talking about? He said the exact line that says in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to say and you're supposed to silence him. Why are you praising him? So now the question is, what's going on here? So if we didn't continue in the Gemara, there's definitely a possible answer one could say. Maybe Rabba held like, okay, they don't say this in the Gemara, but I'm going to suggest a possibility. Maybe Rabba held like the opinion that you don't want matil kin abba maaseh bereshit. Now here, it's not so much kin abba maaseh bereshit because we have both, he's talking about birds and he's talking about animals. So if you hold by that, then theoretically you could say it, because what's Otovet Beno? I just kind of read it very quickly. Otovet Beno is this mitzvah in the Torah that you're not allowed to kill an animal and the son, slaughter them both in one day. Okay, because again, that's showing mercy to animals. So if you hold by the first opinion, then theoretically this would be okay to say, because there's no jealousy, because you're including both animals and birds, and then it would be okay. Possibly. I'm just kind of throwing it out there. But the Gemara tries to give an excuse for Rabba, and what do they say? Rabba l'chidude la'abaye hu debai. He was trying to test Abaye, right? It's like when the teacher makes a mistake, says, I was just testing to see if you were listening, right? To see if anyone would catch my mistake. Apropos all the mistakes I had to correct this morning, right? So it's exactly this idea of, he was trying to see what Abaye was going to react. It was his way of teaching Abaye. Okay. We don't really know what the answer is. I see a suggestion that maybe it was sarcasm, which is possible, but if he was really sarcastic, then Abaye was supposed to pick up on that, and he doesn't, right? He says, what are you talking about? So I don't know if that's a good answer. Okay, next. Now, since we already were talking about a scene in a shul where somebody says something and the rabbi responds, here's another scene where somebody also, the rabbi responds and says, what are you talking about? Right? That's the way we start off Shmona Esrei. Then he continued, ha'adir, v'chazak, v'ha'amitz, and he added all sorts of other praises to God. We saw this a few days ago. Remember that you can't add praises to God in addition to what it says in the prayer, because you'll never have a complete list. It's almost like saying, well, this and nothing else. So comes Rabbi Chanina and basically answers him with that. Amarle, siyamtinu l'shvachei gemarach. What, did you list all the praises of God? Of course you couldn't finish the list. Hashtahane tlata, these three that we say, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora, okay, those, Ilav, the Kachvinu Moshe Bo, right? These are mentioned in the Torah, and that's where they're taken from. So if Moshe had written them in the Torah, Ve'atu Knesset Agdola V'Takminu, and that wouldn't have even been enough. But if the Anshe Knesset Agdola hadn't established those words as the words we can use to praise God, even those, Ana lo amrin lahu, right? If they hadn't done that, we wouldn't have even been able to say these three. It's like a big chiddush that we can say those three. Va'at amart kulei, and you want to add more? And now he says, he gives him an example in case that wasn't clear enough. Mashal adam sheyilu elef alfei alafim dinarei zahav. Right, he had thousands and thousands of dinarim. Right, I'll compare it to our life. Okay, he was a billionaire, let's say. Va'yu makasino to be'elef dinarei kesef lo ganai hulo. Right, if you call a billionaire a millionaire, okay, halavai alai, right? But I don't know if I would be insulted. But theoretically, you could imagine a huge billionaire, would say, what are you talking about? I'm a millionaire. I'm a billionaire, right? It's insulting. So that's basically the concept. Since we were already on Rabbi Chanina, we're going to see another statement of Rabbi Chanina. Amar Rabbi Chanina, hakol bidei shamayim chutz miyirat shamayim. A very, very, very famous line, especially in the world of Jewish thought. Everything is in the hands of God other than yirat shamayim, okay? Fear of God. So, Shneimar, how do we know this? Because of this verse in the Torah. This isn't really connected. This is because Rabbi Chanina said something, Rabbi Chanina said something else. It's a little bit connected because in terms of we said before, if Moshe hadn't said this, right, we wouldn't have been able to. Here's another statement that Moshe says, which is a little perplexing. But Moshe says, Atay Yisrael ma'ashem elokecha sho'el mi'imach ki'im li'yir'ah. Right, there's a famous pasuk in Sefer Dvarim, in Moshe's speech to the Jewish people. He says, listen, what does God want from you? He just wants you to fear God. That's it. Okay, just that. Now, Gemara. So there you see, everything is b'yedei shamayim, everything in the hands of God except for that. That's all we have to do is have fear of God. So again, this is a whole what this means, and I'm not going to go into all that, right? But it's a big statement. So now the Gemara asks, Michlal, wait a minute. This pasuk seems to imply D'yir'ah milta zutarti. It sounds like it's a very easy thing, okay? Because Moshe says, this is all he asks, one little thing, just have fear of God. That's it. not a big deal, right? We all know having fear of God is quite a difficult task. So they say, well, Moshe really meant it. It really is a small thing. Why? Legabe Moshe Rabbeinu milta zutartehi. For Moshe, it was a very small thing. First of all, it's pretty easy to have Yirat Shamayim when you're in contact with God, right? It's much more difficult when you're not in contact with God. For him, this was a small thing. So that's why he said, this is just a small thing. Mashal Adam shemivakshim memenu kli gadol v'yesh lo, domeh alav kekli katan. If you ask someone for a big vessel and he has it, it looks like you're asking from a kli katan. If we go back to the wealth example, right? You ask a billionaire for a donation of $10,000, for him, it's like pennies, but you ask a regular person for $10,000, that's a lot of money. So it's all relative, right? That's basically what they're saying. So for Moshe, he had it. So for him, it was something little, but katan ve'en lo, but if, you have a small one, if they ask you for a small one and you don't even have a small one, domeh alav kekli gadol, right? For him, that's considered a huge vessel. Okay. So now the big question of this Gemara, and I'm not going to answer it, but I'm going to raise it and then say that I was pleased to see that the commentaries also asked this question, which is, how could Moshe, let's admit that this was a small thing for Moshe, okay? But for the rest of the people, it was not a small thing. Moshe's talking in his speech to the people and talking to them, he should be speaking to them in their language and saying, I know this is a big deal, but it's important. Instead of saying, this is all God asked, it's a very simple thing. So it's really a question on the sugya, which they don't address, which is really, how could Moshe have spoken that way? If he wasn't speaking only about himself, he was speaking to the people. Either you can say Moshe wasn't in touch with the people, but I find that hard to imagine. So it's a really good question. Okay, moving on. Amar Rabbi Zeva, haomer shma shma, keomer modim modim dami. Saying shma twice was also a problem. It's just like saying modim modim twice. Again, not clear. Does it mean you say the word Shema twice? Does it mean you say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad twice? Does it mean you say all the parshiot twice? Right? It's not so clear. Meitive. But now they're going to bring a contradiction to the statement of Rabbi Zera. HaKoreh et Shema b'kofla harei ze meguneh. If you read the Shema and then read it a second time, this is behavior that should be condemned. So the Gemara says, meguneh u'dahavi, but shituke lo mishatkinan le. There's one thing to say what you're doing is not appropriate. But to silence someone, and basically, let's say if they're a chazan, kick them out from being chazan, that's much stronger. So why in one place does it say it's talking about the exact same thing, but it uses different words to describe what we think of this? And one is more harsh than the other. So lo kasha, really no difficulty here. And here it's going to say very simply, but there's a big machloket here, which is a classic. This one's in this case, that one's in that case. But Rashi says one thing, Rabbeinu Chananel says the opposite. So here, and that's why I told you we're going to get to this issue of the psukim or the words, but we're not going to have much clarity about it. Lo kashya, hada amar milta milta v'tanila, hada amar psuka psuka v'tanila. One of them is talking about where you said shma shma, and the other is talking about where you said the whole pasuk and then you repeated the pasuk. We don't know which is which. Rashi says one, Rabbeinu Chananel says the other. I'm not going to get into the details because really you can go both ways, obviously, which is worse. He says to him, he asked the following question. Rav Papa asked Rabbi, but I don't understand. I could see a scenario where I would say Shema twice. And it's not because I believe in two different gods. It's that the first time I said it, I didn't have kavanah. And you're supposed to have kavanah when you say the pasuk Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. I didn't have intent. And then I realized I didn't have intent, so I repeat it. So that's not like I believe in two gods, to which Rava really goes after him. And he says, what, are you like God's friend that you think you could do this? We take a hammer or some sort of instrument, a hard instrument, and we smash you in the head if you don't have kavanah. You don't just say, oh, sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Now I'll do it again. We don't do that kind of thing. No, you should have kavanah from the beginning. You don't just say, oh, I'm talking to someone, and I might say, right, this happens all the time where, unfortunately, this happens in our world, right? Somebody's on their phone and they're not paying attention when you say something. And then they're, oh, sorry, I was on my phone. It's insulting enough to do that to a person, but to do it to God, much more insulting. Going back to the two last cases of the Mishnah, then we'll get to a new Mishnah, fascinating one. Someone who explains the arayot in a parable kind of manner, we silence him. Tana Rav Yosef, like what? Kalon aviv klonimo. Okay, we all know that there's things that go on in our own houses that, people on the street look like they behave very nicely in their own houses. Unfortunately, they do all sorts of other things, and not always behave perfectly in their own house. So what are we saying? Legalot knaf imo or something. What does it mean to reveal the erva of your mother, which means to actually have relations with your mother? But instead of understanding it that way, they explained it as you basically go out in public and tell things about your mother or father that are embarrassing. My parents did this, my parents did that. Legalot, right? To reveal, instead of revealing the erva, what it means is to reveal, you explain the verse is saying you reveal all sorts of things about them that are private, okay, or that are bad things they've done. That's considered, if you explain the verse that way, euphemistically, and not the way it really means, that's wrong, because that's not what the verse means. Okay, this reminds me, by the way, I had a teacher in 6th or 7th grade, and we got up to the arayot in the Torah where you can't sleep with this one, you can't sleep with that one. And basically the teacher says, okay, we're going to skip these verses. And of course, the wise Alec in the class, she raises her hand and she says, why would we skip verses? I don't understand. By the way, this connects with the next section also. And he starts saying, well, he doesn't really want to talk about them, because you can see people were uncomfortable teaching this, especially to young girls. And he was a man. And then, finally he says, okay, he says, why don't we have a vote? Who wants to learn these and who doesn't want to learn these? So he says, okay, who wants to learn them? Of course, all the girls raised their hand, and he basically had to teach it. And he kind of went through it very quickly and moved on. But it was something that always stuck in my head. So it's like the same thing here. People are scared to say these things. They don't want to use these words to describe, to talk about it. By the way, again, we're going to get to this later also, this whole idea. And you can't learn this stuff. Okay, if yesterday was all about inclusion and diversity, today is all about unfortunate situations like the Chaim Walder situation, and people using their, right, and people whitewashing it and not wanting to talk about it and not wanting to use these words and bring them up and try to say, oh, this isn't really what happened and this doesn't go on in our community. We'll talk about it even more as we go on. But it's already kind of mentioned here, this idea that people don't like to talk about these things. And look what that leads to when you don't talk about things. But here they're really talking not about that. They're really talking about that you're misinterpreting the verses, and you can't do that kind of thing. He explains it. What did they mean? Yisrael habala kutid. Okay, Yisrael who sleeps with a kutid, who was considered a non-Jewish woman. What's the zaracha? He has a son who lahavir lamolech. He gets pregnant, and he impregnates a woman to have a son who's now going to worship idols because his mother is an idol worshiper. Okay, so that's the kutid is used here a little out of context. Often kutid is really the shomer name. They didn't necessarily, by the way, believe in idols, but I think the idea here often kutid is used as just a synonymous term for someone who worships idols. Okay, next Mishnah is all about censorship. And this is a fascinating topic, and I highly recommend you listen to Gefet this week. It's about censorship in general. It's really about one of the things that we're going to see in this list and different interpretations of why it was censored out. Very fascinating. Machloket, we'll touch on it, but you can really see many different interpretations in the Gefet this week. Ma'aseh Reuven nikra v'lo mitargem. We're going to have a list. Now remember, they read from the Torah in public and they translated. So now we're going to have a list of things that either can be read and translated, or can be read but not translated because they really didn't want people to understand it, or can't be read at all. Okay, these things don't get read in the synagogue. It's not appropriate to read them. So, Ma'aseh Reuven, what does it say in the Torah? It says that Reuven slept with Bilhah, his father's maidservant, right? So that's a terrible thing, right? All different things. What he did exactly, did he just move the bed so his father would sleep with her? Did he not really sleep with her? I'm not going to get into that, but according to this, even though it's right, because it looks like Reuven slept with Bilhah, it says here, it's nikra v'lo mitargem. We do not translate it. We don't want people to understand that verse. Maseh Tamar. Okay, that was a pretty bad incident, right? Yehuda ends up thinking Tamar's a prostitute, sleeps with her. It turns out it was his daughter-in-law. So nikra u'mitargem, you can read it and you can translate it. By the way, I remember, skipping this also in elementary school. Okay, Maseh Egel Harishon, the first description of Chet HaEgel, Nikra u'mitargem, you can read it. But Hasheni Nikra v'lo mitargem, but the second section, and we'll see later why, this is what Gefet is all about, is read but not translated. Birkat, this is more when Moshe and Aharon have a discussion about what went on there. Birkat Kohanim, which is a weird one, okay? The blessings of the Kohanim in the Torah, we'll get back to this later. Maaseh David v'Amnon, which is Amnon b'Tamar, this incident where he rapes Tamar in the Navi. Nikra'im v'lo mitargemim, are read but not translated. You can't read the Maaseh Merkava. We talked about this the other day, right? It's very hard to understand. You can't read it. By the way, it was interesting because before it seemed like you could read it, right? In yesterday's daf, but now you're going to see because Rabbi Yehuda Matir. Okay, it was Rabbi Yehuda, by the way, in yesterday's daf that they asked the question on about the Merkava because he was the one who said you can read it, and they said, "Oh, you say you can read it, and yet nobody understands it. So what are you worried about the blind person not understanding what he's saying?" For Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Hodat Yerushalayim is a section which talks about all the despicable things that went on in Jerusalem. We don't want to hang out, air our dirty laundry outside, so we don't talk about that. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, so those two, by the way, just never get read in shul in general, not read, not translated. And again, both those things are, the first one was a machloket, whether you can read Maaseh Merkava or not. We do, in fact, read it as a Navi, in the Navi, as a Haftorah. And Rabbi Eliezer says, we don't maftir in Hodat Yerushalayim, and that's one person's opinion. We'll see later that there's a different opinion. The next long section is going to be a braita, okay? A long braita that every minute or every few seconds, they're going to stop and explain and ask questions about it. So it's going to be a braita that's kind of chopped up. And if you could see the chart, there's the braita, and then there's a list. Okay, we're going to have three categories. Tanu Rabbanan, yesh nikrim u'mitargamim, same idea, things that are read and translated. Yesh nikrim v'lo mitargamim, read but not translated. V'yesh lo nikrim v'lo mitargamim. And then there's things that are not read and not translated. So now they say, which are which? Okay, so we're going to start with, the lists are going to get shorter and shorter. The first one's the longest, the ones that you do read and you do translate, which is just interesting in and of itself. They're not pro-censorship, okay? Sometimes they need to, but they're really not trying to promote it. And that's why the longest list are all these things that, and we're going to have to say each one, why are they listed? You wouldn't say, okay, you can read the parsha of Abraham going to Israel. Like, why would you bother saying that? Of course you could read it and translate it. So they're going to pick sections that are questionable and then explain what's questionable about the section and why do we read it anyway. Okay, sometimes they won't exactly explain why they read it anyway, and some of them they'll explain why they do, but the whole question is going to be, why are they even in this list? Like if you read them and translate them, aren't they like everything else? Why do they need special mention? So here's the Rashi Tevot to remember, Balat Akan Nishpeh Siman. Maaseh Bereshit Nikra Umitargem. No, the creation of the world is read and translated. So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Say, well, right. I know when I was in school, we skipped Bereshit in the beginning. I know my kids learned it here, but in America, when I grew up, we skipped it, okay, because it's very hard to understand. And not only is it hard to understand, but it's hard to understand in a philosophical manner, right? Like if you're older, forget about first grade, second grade, I get it. But it's actually a little strange because you really could explain it pretty simply to first graders. I really don't know. We started with Lech Lecha. But Pshita, the Gemara says, isn't this obvious? So Ma'uditema Ata L'Shiyule. Mala mata, right? People might start to say, well, what's above, what's below? Where's God? Who created God? How did this happen? Malafanimu malachor, what happened before the creation of the world? What happened after the creation of the world? We know that this is a topic that raises a lot of serious questions. So maybe you shouldn't. Kamash Balan, you can read it, you can translate it. Masel lot u'shtei bedotav. Remember his daughters after the destruction of Sodom, they come and they basically sleep with him and they give birth to Ammon and Moab. They get him drunk, right? It's a terrible story. So Pshita, isn't it obvious that you could read this? Because, okay, so what? It was Lot. What do we, okay, we make Lot look bad, but we don't have any particular, problem with making Lot look bad or his daughters. Well, Avram. Well, he comes from Avraham. So wouldn't you think that's important? So Kamash Malan. No, well, even we're not worried about that. We still read it. Maset Tamar v'Yehuda. These next two are very interesting. The reason why these didn't really explain why you read them anyway. Okay, but this one, they're going to explain why you read it anyway, despite the problematic nature of the content. Maset Tamar v'Yehuda nikra umitargem. So the Gemara says again, Pshita. They say, well, ma'u detema lichush l'chvodo de Yehuda. You might have thought we're worried about making Yehuda look bad. Kamash malan shvach Yehuda ode. In the end, and this is where you really get back to the Chaim Walder and all these terrible stories that go on in our community, that teacher in Shalvim and all these terrible stories. Here it says, you might have thought, right, it's humiliating to them, but in the end, Shvach Yehuda Ode, it's actually praiseworthy, the story, it looks good for Yehuda, because in the end, what does he say? The important line, Sadka mimeni, okay, right? He says she was right, and he admits he was wrong. There's nothing more important than admitting you're wrong, right? That I think in all these cases, if the people would get up and admit what they had done, right? It wouldn't make it any better, but we would at least see them in a different light than basically denying everything that went on. So here, the fact that he admits is already something very important, and it's an important message to say, right? This is why also is this so connected to these issues, because part of what, I've been reading, and, it's hard not to read all about these things that are going on, but that a lot of the problem is in their communities that it goes back to how they teach Tanakh and how they teach, they never made mistakes. They never, and that if the avot are perfect, then we view people in our community who are in higher positions as being perfect. And we can't possibly see that they have flaws. And that's why their communities, some of the people in their communities are unwilling to even understand that there's a flaw, because they think, right, that this world is in, and it's fascinating because we've talked a lot before how, earlier in the Masechet, it was people are all good or all bad, but the Gemara never literally meant that, right? They don't mean these things that everybody's perfectly good and perfectly bad. You see from lots of other texts in the Gemara that it's not that way. And there's a process. And here, right, I see you're right? This whole idea of whoever says, Davi chatai no ela to'eh. Yes, there are statements like that. However, it's very clear that the Gemara doesn't really mean that literally, okay? And that there's ways to understand it. And it's a problem when we understand these things literally, right? It's also said about Reuven, by the way. Whoever said Reuven sinned here is Eno Ela Toeh. But yet, right, they say we read it, right? We read it, here they're worried about translating because they don't want, right? It's this fine line we have to take. It's very tricky here because there's things, yes, we could say, things no, we could say, depending on what. So, okay, moving on. What about Maseh Egel Arishon, Nikra Umitargem? So again, the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? So, Ma'u Tetem Alichush L'chvodan Shel Yisrael. Maybe, right, it looks bad for the Jews. They worshipped an idol. Well, Kamash Malan Koshkin Denichalu. Again, this has a positive side. What was it? Tahavilu Kapara. We learn about God pardoning us for our sins, right? That's an important thing to learn about, right? It's important to learn about sins that you can learn about getting out of sin. That's super important. Klalot ubrachot nikrinu mitargimi, right? Something that Chaim Walder was not able to do, right? He couldn't get beyond it and figure out a way out of it. Obviously, the next question is, right, which is a question we've talked about before. That's not what we're discussing here. How do you know if someone really gets over it? And when do you know that they can't be accepted back into the community? That's a whole separate question. Okay, the curses and the blessings in the Torah. So, right, there's sections that talk about if you do good, you'll get blessed. If you sin, you'll be cursed. And, it seems to imply the curses are, the curses are going to come true at some point. So, pshita, isn't that obvious? Maybe it'll depress people and they'll say, why should I bother doing this? Oh, it's going to be doomsday in the end anyway. Kamash malan that you read it anyway. Asharot va'onashim. Okay, the warnings not to do sin and the punishments that you'll get for those sins are read and translated. Pshita, isn't that obvious? I mean, we have it all over the Torah. Of course, we want to read that. So, you might think that that'll cause people to worship God out of fear of sin, of punishment. And that's not good. We want people to worship God out of love. Kamash malan that we read it anyway. Maseh Amnon b'Tamar nikra umitargem. So the story of Amnon b'Tamar is read and translated. Maseh Avshalom nikra umitargem. This is in brackets, but that means it wasn't in the printed text, but it really was in the earlier text. It should be read. So also Avshalom, who rebels against David. These are two of David's sons who do bad things. Pshita. Obviously, we're going to read them and translate them. No. Ma'u d'tem anichush likari de David. You might have got worried that this is going to look bad about David. Kamash malan that you can. Maseh pilegesh b'giv'ah nikra umitargem. This is where they chopped up the body of the pilegesh and sent her to 12, right? The body parts of all the different shvatim, and it was this terrible incident, right? I mean, it was before that they killed her, and they killed this terrible story, and then it became this civil war. Pshita that we read it. So they say, well, it definitely makes Binyamin look very bad. Kamash malan that it's okay. According to this, it is read and it is translated against Rabbi Eliezer. So they say pshita. So now they say, no, well, it's lafukim to Rabbi Eliezer. Since there's a machloket, this Braita wants to tell you we don't agree with Rabbi Eliezer. And instead of quoting Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah, they quote Rabbi Eliezer from a Braita, which has a more elaborate description of Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Someone got up and he started reading this in the shul, in Rabbi Eliezer's shul. Now, Rabbi Eliezer says you shouldn't be reading this. So why is someone in his shul reading this, right? It's almost like a slap in his face. So he gets very offended. Amarlo, If you want to start listing all the terrible things that the Yerushalayim they did, go look and see all the terrible things your mother did. Okay, this is like when people insult you and say son of, I'm not going to say it, but that they curse the mother almost, which is an interesting thing, right? The rabbi would do this also, but he basically says, go check your lineage. I bet there's something messed up there. And in fact, they found what he was basically saying is you're such a disrespectful person that there must be something wrong in your lineage, because they always believed that lineage was connected with how you behave. And in fact, they found out it was true. So there you see his opinion very strongly, but this Braita goes against his opinion. So that was the whole first category. Now we get to the next one. So these are the ones you read, but you don't translate. Censorship. Ravdan Siman. Maaseh Reuven Nekava lo metargem. Don't translate the Maaseh Reuven. Maaseh Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Shalach Likvul. Here's a Maaseh about this story. He went to the city of Kful, Vayakol Chazan Knesset, Vayibishkon Yisrael, which is the verse before. Va'amar lo l'metargeman afsek al tetargem ela acharon. Okay, only the end of that verse, if you remember, it's a very strange verse. It says, Vayishkav Vayelach Reuven Vayishkav et Bilha Pilegesh Aviv Vayishma Yisrael, and then there's a break in the middle of a verse. We talked just yesterday about section breaks, and then it says Vayu bnei Yaakov Shnei Masar. He says only read that part, only translate that part of the pasuk. Don't translate the earlier part. So there you see this actually happening, and the rabbis praised him for doing this. Maaseh Egel Hasheni Nekava lo metargem. Ez Maaseh Egel Hasheni min Vayomer Moshe Ab Vayar Moshe. It's about 4 or 5 psukim in the chapter 32 in Shmot, where it talks about Moshe says to Aaron, and then it says, and Moshe saw, ki eta'am ki paruahu, the nation was parua, they were wild, ki pera'o aharon l'shimtza b'kamehen, because Aharon caused all this. Now, some people say that's the verse, it says until that verse. Question is, including that verse or not including that verse? And that leads to a big debate about what's wrong with it. Is it that we're pointing fingers at Aaron and we're making Aaron look bad? Or is it this other verse, which we're going to see in a minute, which could be translated in 2 different ways, or actually there's more in Gefet you can see, but I'll read it inside here and I'll translate a little bit. Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Le'olam yeh adam zahir b'tshuvotav, be careful what you say. Shemitoch tshuva, when you answer a question, be careful what you say. Shemitoch tshuva sheshivo Aaron leMoshe paklu hama'aririm. Because of something Aaron said to Moshe, people can come to a misconception. Shene'emar v'ashlicheu ba'esh, right? When he said, what did you do? Aaron said, I threw it in the fire, and look, this idol came out. Now, this has 2 problems. One is either to say, it sounds like there really was an idol, like something real came out, makes you believe there's such a real thing as idols, and maybe that's the problem. But if you take this pasuk where he says, I see it's Aharon who's at fault, this is classic, right? There's some people who are self-deprecating. When something goes wrong, they immediately, right? Some people shirk responsibility. Other people say, oh, I was fully responsible for this, even though they weren't. But if you say that, people will believe it. And that's what happened here. Aaron said it. And then the next verse is, Moshe was upset. Ki Aharon was really the one who caused everyone. Ki Aharon, he caused everyone to go and sin. And then it makes it like Aaron's the main person who did everything wrong. And we don't want that because, we don't believe that he was really the main thing behind this. So there's 2 different ways of understanding, right? Is it Aaron's blaming himself, or is it Vayetzei Egel Hazeh? And that's the focus. Or there's even a third. You can listen to Gefet for that. Birkat Kohanim Niklim V'lo Metargemim. Why? My time on Mishum Yisa, because it says Yisa Shepanav Elecha, like God favors the Jews. We don't want to say God favors the Jews over everyone else. Okay, big question. What do you mean? We have sources that do say this. I'm going to leave that question aside. Maseh David Amnon Lo Niklim V'lo Metargemim. This is very confusing. We said that is red. So how isn't Amnon ben David the same as Amnon ben Tamar? So lo kashya. Hadechtiv Amnon ben David. Hadechtiv Amnon stam. If it just says Amnon, it's okay. When it says Amnon, the son of David, that you don't want to read because that reflects poorly on David. Okay. Last section for today and for this parak, and I think that this might actually be a potential reason why they switched the order of the prakim, because I don't think they really wanted to end a Masechet with this. And with that, we'll read this section. Tanu Rabbanan, there's all these words that are used in the Torah that are maybe a little too strong and harsh and maybe a little obscene. We don't want to use them. We change them. Okay, this is what we call a kriyuktiv. And often you see it when we're reading something from the Nevi'im, and there's something on the side that says, read it this way instead of that way. So here we're going to go through a list. We'll go through it kind of quickly. Kigon yishagelna yishakevna. Okay, to yishaglena is clearly having sexual relations, whereas yishakevna, to lie down, could mean having sexual relations, might not mean, so switch it for that word. Ba'opalim batcholim. These are hemorrhoids. So clearly, apulim is a worse word. Cholim is a better way to say it. This you have to be sensitive to the language, right? We're not sensitive to this language as much. Chiryonim dibyonim. This is excrement. So use the word chiryonim, use the word divyonim. Here we're going to also change charehem, which comes from chiryonim, to a different word. Lecholet charehem ulishtotem memeshinehem, right? People will be eating their excrement and drinking their urine. Lecholet soatam ulishtotem meme raglehem. Change the words to a word that's a better word to say it with, right? Not as grotesque. Limacharaot, which is the same root as this chara, right? That's soa, the excrement. Limotzaot, things that come out of your body. That's already, right, a much nicer way to say it. Rabbi Shua ben Korchomer limacharaot kishman. In that pasuk, you can actually say it. It's describing avodah zarah. When we talk about idols, we can use whatever disgusting words we want. Okay, and that's an interesting. Right? We're talking about the Jews sinning. We don't want to use such terrible words. Amarav Nachman kolitz anuta asira. Any kind of word that's not appropriate word is forbidden. Bar miletz anuta davodah zarah desharia, unless we're using it to describe idols. Tichtiv kara bel kores nevo. Right, Baal, which is an idol in nevo, bent down and kores. He crouched, which is crouched to defecate. So therefore, you see that the Torah, they use that language, we can use it for avodah zarah. Uktiv karsu kra'u yachdav lo yachlu malet masa. Right? This is also, right? They couldn't not keep it in. Rabbi Yana Amar Mehacha, leglop beit avin yagur shchan shomron ki avel alav uchmarav alav yagilu al kvodo ki galami menu. Because of the glory that left it. Okay, this is because of all the shomron, where all the avodah zarah was. Al tikrei kvodo ela kvedo. Don't read it as kvodo, glory. Read it as kvedo. It's heavy burden, which is what it needed to, it's the waste it needed to remove from its body. So here you see all these references to excrement and all that having to do with idols. Therefore, it seems okay to say. I hope you're convinced by what I said, that who would want to end a Masechet with this. You can say, okay, this especially, I would say this one. You can say to an Ovei Kochavim, Shikle Lavodah Zarah, take your Avodah Zarah away, Va'anche B'shin Tav Shelo, and put it in under your buttocks. Okay, you're allowed to use that term when you're talking to someone who's worshiping idols and you want to get rid of your idols. Amrav Ashi Haiman Desnai Shumane Sharile Levazuye Begimel B'shin. Anyone who has a bad reputation, you're allowed to say things like you're a Gimel B'shin. Okay, what exactly that means? Again, some people say it's the son of a harlot. Some people explain it in different ways. Again, it sounds like you can insult your mother, the person's mother, which is a whole interesting thing in and of itself. And thankfully, they want to end on a positive note. And this is it's interesting because we've been talking about haftorahs, and haftorahs often they end on a bad note, and we repeat an earlier verse that's a positive one, or we add a verse from somewhere else that's positive. So here we end with Haiman Deshapir Shumane, but someone has a good reputation. Shari L'Shabucha, you're allowed to praise him. Maybe it's like the way we said, don't praise God, but here you can praise humans. Uman Deshavcha Yanuchu Lo Brachot Arosho, and if you praise him, you'll get a lot of blessings on your head. With that, we end the chapter. Hadran Alacha Koret Megillah Omed. Finished with today's daf. Have a great day, everyone.